Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for tipping the waiter before the meal. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mikkel Svendsen. About one console generation ago, I worked on lighting, water, effects, and the spoiler on Playdead's Inside, and even had the honor of doing a couple of talks about it. Today, I get to represent Geometric Interactive and talk about our game COCOON and show you some lighting, water, fog, effects, and even warp into some orbs. Please silence your phones. During the big Zelda Breath of the Wild talk in 2017, someone in the front center row had their phone blast off at full volume in the middle of the talk, and that someone was me. All right. COCOON's development began with Jeppe Carlsen in 2017, and together with fellow Playdead alumni Jacob Schmidt, they formed Geometric Interactive. Early on, they met our talented art director, Erwin Cho, who was brought on to solve some of the visual mysteries of the game's cosmic journey. Then, in late 2018, I joined with my nerd graphics to find solutions to the technical puzzles of the production. After years of hard work with a talented team of artists, designers, and engineers, the game was born, and it looks a little something like this. Normally, this is where I would switch from the opening shot of our trailer to my presentation slides. But today, I'm going to do something a little different. I'm still going to talk about graphics and stuff, but instead of advancing slides, we'll zoom out. So, here in this canyon where the game begins is the perfect place to show you the lighting. The indirect lighting is a baked light probes or volumetric light maps or whatever you want to call spherical harmonics irradiance stored in voxels. By themselves, they look like this. The game was shipped on Unity 2020 LTS using EuroP10, and our indirect lighting replaces the various global illumination techniques found within the engine. Before implementing our custom light baker, the game looked like this. The indirect was just two directional lights stored in a uniform spherical harmonic. But we didn't want to use light maps because of the lack of support for things like transparent particles or fog or animated or skinned meshes. But we still wanted higher fidelity than just a spatially uniform directional ambient lighting thing. So in our spherical harmonics, we have irradiance, which is a fancy term for incoming light or light that can be seen from a given point. This is then turned into radiance by materials, which is another fancy term for materials show the lighting they saw bounce into your eyes. Our spherical harmonics are first order, meaning that they have two bands, one of an ambient component and another band of three directional components. We tried second order, but it showed diminishing returns on our mostly diffuse surfaces. Each of these four components is full-signed HDR color, which is a lot. During baking, it's stored as half-precision floating point, which adds up to 192 bits per voxel. That's a bit. Luckily, lighting is always positive, which means that, the ambient part at least can be stored as BC6H, which is a hardware texture compression for unsigned HDR color textures. This saves about 40 bits, but that brings us down to 152 bits per voxel, still quite a bit. Directions, however, are signed, and while BC6H supports it, we can remove said sign by adding the ambient part to the directional part and use BC6H on the rest of them to get down to 32 bits per voxel. This is what that looks like. That's quite noisy and still quite JPEG-y. BC1, which is another hardware texture compression technique used for normalized ranges, would help if the directional component was fixed range instead of floating range. You can do that just by dividing the directional part by the ambient part, making it normalized as we store it, and then multiplying again while we're reading it. And that looks like this. It gets rid of most of the noise. It's quite tolerable at this point, and we're all the way down to 24 bits per voxel. Quite good. So another reason that we use voxels is because it lets us avoid parameterizing our meshes. We don't have to do light map UVs or anything like that. But light maps, like light maps, we also use charts and atlases. So this is what one chart looks like. It's just a bounding box around a particular subscene. And in the top right corner, you see what the data of that looks like. And as we zoom out, you can see that the charts are then, multiple charts are in each scene, and they together make up a atlas. And you see what one atlas looks like on the right there. Now, to bake one of these charts, we need ray tracing. But I didn't want to implement and maintain an API like optics or DXR or something like that. Luckily, we already kind of have a ray tracer in the form of the rasterizer, because rasterization, if you think about it, is really just a ray tracer that traces a grid of rays that share an origin point in the perspective camera case, or they share a direction in the orthographic camera case. So in order to do this ray tracing, we simply render a camera from an isometric point of view with a texture 2D array. And then our view and projection matrices are simply defined by our chart's transform and bounding volume. And then we just have it render out with as many instances as we have slices in our voxel texture. Then in the vertex shader, we simply just set the slice ID to be the instance ID and add the position, offset the position by the slice ID so that each slice starts at that particular point. Now, this generates a ray tracer that can just look forward, so we need to be able to store a direction and stuff like that, which is where our ray matrix comes in. This lets us control the ray direction, as well as an offset and a Tmin, Tmax, which are basically just edits to the near plane and far plane of this particular projection matrix. And yeah, then we just set one of these ray matrices with a random direction, a random jitter of about 1 voxel, and also use a near plane offset of about 1 voxel size to avoid any self-shadowing and that kind of problem that we don't really want to see. And yeah, we just multiply this matrix as the last thing in our vertex shader. So instead of maintaining DXR or meta passes, we just have to include this one macro in the vertex program to make it compatible with the Baker. All this is just, so that we get things to be out of the box. We don't need to have super complicated shaders. We can just use one shader for everything. Avoids copy-paste errors. Anyway, finally, we have a little extra detail. You'll see maybe now, yeah, it looks good on the projector. I've removed our vertex occlusion. So if you look at sort of like the strip of, what's it called, rock down just below the surface, I'm going to add it back now. So that's what that looks like. This is just made using regular physics rays that are just distributed randomly across a triangle with some random directions. But then the way that they're added is, of course, this little trick. So this is using a spherical harmonic triple product, which is just a multiplication product and a dot product that come together. I think it's a neat way to compose multiple spherical harmonic data together. Now, these little details about the vertex occlusion just means that we can heavily reduce the resolution of our voxels and get away with a lot less. And we also allow them to be painted manually, which just gives a nice way to darken the ambient if need be. Anyway, let's shift gears. So, we now just jumped out of the world contained within this world, and we've been given this very bright and ponderable orb. It's a bit of a torch to light the way in our adventure, and naturally, it has a point light in it. Let me remove it and build that effect up again. So, just turned off the point light, and let's build up everything that makes the orb. We're going to start with the sun directional light, and I think we're going to have to zoom in a little bit just to see the details. Much better. So first, of course, the orb just has to cast shadows. And that sounds trivial, but yeah, that looks like this. Now it can cast shadows. The only trick that's applied here is that we make sure that we only cast with the back face of the glass so that it doesn't self-shadow the interior, and we get the interior nicely lit up. Then, of course, the diorama can cast shadows. There's no trick there. And then comes the point light. So the point light also has some shadows from the diorama in it. They're just made using a baked shadow texture that's just particularly used for this fog effect. We don't want it to be casting on the environment around it. That would be too noisy. Anyway, then let's turn around because we got to look at some feet. All right. So we still want the character to cast shadows on the ground, even though we don't have point light shadows. And that looks like this. That's a little too subtle. So let me just turn off the sunlight and try one more time. Pay attention to the feet. There you go. So now that's clear. So this is just our take on capsule shadows. It's just two lines, one line going from one toe to the head and the other line going from the head from the other toe. And then it's got some thickness to it and a little bit of feathering to it. So the way that this is done is we just project these lines from the light source down to the ground plane, get the distance to these lines, and then add this feather blur. This looks much better than what shadow maps could otherwise provide for us, and since they weren't supported in this particular version of the engine, that's nice. I don't think I have to sell anyone on the joy of a good capsule shadow. Anyway, so the mist that you find within the fog is this noisy height and depth fog that just gives the interior of that or some volume to it. So let's just try to like peel back those layers one more time and zoom in, and now there's no fog. All right, so the height fog itself is just to like sink the diorama into it, sort of, hide where it stops. And then the depth fog is to make it totally opaque, which looks like this. This is just because we don't want our orb to be actually transparent for performance reasons also. So like that's just like, making sure that it's opaque at the way back. And then we add some noise texture to that, and that's really it. It's just a ray marched effect. The ray marching is simply done in, a fixed number of steps, and to account for the step length, when you're integrating this, you just need to take the alpha to the power of the step length in order to make sure that each step contributes a correct linear amount. Finally, let's talk about the reflective glass. So, you know the drill by now. I'm just going to peel away these effects and just build it up recipe step by recipe step. That's my favorite way to go about it. All right, zoom in, and no glass. All right, so the first bit of it is just a specular highlight. It's the same specular highlight you would expect on any other shader throughout the game. Just works with any sort of light type, nothing fancy. Then on the bottom, if you notice, boop, there's a tiny little bit of a little Fresnel going on there. These things just add to this contribution so far. It kind of just milkifies it a little bit, reduces the contrast, makes it a bit less harsh. And then we have one final component, which is this fake screen space reflection. So it's basically just wrapping the environment texture in over the orb. We had real, screen space reflections at some point, but this looked a lot. The fake stuff looked a lot better than the real stuff. Anyway, this is then the total contribution of that glass, and that's how that looks on the orb again. Now, all these bits are just so that the orb fits into any environment, despite it being a very glowing, emissive-based orb. I think it's nice that it just fits into any environment, regardless of lighting situation. Now, about that world within that world. As we charge it up, it milks up, opens up, and we jump through. And we're back. All right. And out. And there's the orb. So, that effect has a few steps. Let's break that down. Stop. All right. So rendering a world within a world is, you probably guessed it by now, and in a camera. And you probably also guessed this one, and out of camera. And they're just composed with the orb. That's it, nothing. There is a few performance considerations to just rendering two cameras. So let's go about checking out the ways to optimize this one. All right. So for the inner camera, there's quite a lot going on. As we zoom out, there's quite a lot of draw calls and quite a lot of small geometry that we really want to be hygienic about. So when we are just wandering around the world at normal zoom levels, the density of the world is perfectly fine. But out here, this is a large geometry. So since we can't see behind the orb's edges, it's very simple to just take the culling matrix of the orb, of the camera, and crop them down to the orb so we don't render anything outside. So now we don't have any draw calls that we can't see. Now, obviously, you can't see those pixels either, so you can just use a scissor rectangle to get rid of those as well. Now we don't have any fragments out there. But you still see these little spiky sides there. Well, if we just take the orb and use that to render anything that's outside the orb's view to the near plane depth, boom, then we get a tight crop, and we don't render any fragments that we don't need. The same thing goes for the other camera. We just render the orb early in our depth prepass so that there aren't any fragments that are shaded that don't need to be there. And that looks like this. And then, of course, these are just composed using, when you render two cameras and you just don't clear between the two of them? That's what's going on. So that just gets rendered behind it. We render the sub camera first, then the other camera, and they kind of come together with a single resolve or a single post effect that saves post effects. We like not doing post effects twice. All right, that is sort of the essential performance hygiene, but there's just a couple more things. Also, I need to get back. All right, so to get the player to render in both sides, we used to have a third camera, but the third camera is bad. So what we did was simply have the player rendered in the main camera, and then we take the transform that's relative between the two cameras to teleport it over to the other camera when we need it to be there. Then there is the trouble of shadows. At this distance, that's an awful lot of shadow draw calls and shadow texels. So specifically for this, in any far environment, we have this thing called the static shadow map, which is just a very low-res shadow map for the entire world that's stored as BC4. That doesn't change over the course of the whole game. It's just a regular serialized asset, and we get to use that for example, in these orbs here. And then we have this fisheye effect. What do I mean by that? Well, now it's off. Let me turn it on again. So it's not just for looks. It's not just for the zoom effect. It's also because it helps us get rid of some more fragments. So if I remove it again, you can see that this is a lot of fragments we could actually get rid of since they get outside the fisheye effect. So what we do is, you guessed it, it's a scissor rectangle. So now we don't need like half the fragments of any of it, frankly, at this point. And we can just get away with rendering just this part and then stretching that out to fill the rest of the screen. So that's another way we just like, I don't know, reduce the load on the GPU doing a good warp. Finally, we use 16-bit depth during our depth prepass because some platforms that ran a lot faster. This does mean that you would get a lot of artifacts with 16-bit depth, so we just move out the near plane quite far when we're warping. And the same thing goes for the fog. The fog is, segue, a Froxel solution, so we need lots of set depth in the fog, and that's also why we move out the near plane when we're rendering this bit here. And yeah, I went too fast. There you go. Anyway, so about that fog. Like I said, the fog is a Froxel solution. It's about 128 by 64 by 256. It is doing single scattering in its shading. So that means that at each voxel, it is holding the color of the light and the material and the alpha of that given point. And that's just a regular shading function that you would find in any sort of transparent shader throughout the game. There's nothing fancy going on there. The sort of gotcha about this fog is that it is pre-integrated, meaning that we run a compute shader before we actually use anything, so that at any given point in this voxel volume, you don't have like what fog is at that point, you have all fog between that point and the eye. This then means that when you're rendering some geometry, either transparent or opaque, you just sample the fog once, and you get the entire fog contribution between the eye and that point. This then means that it's compatible with, say, MSAA and all those types of things in sort of a naive, implemented way, which is kind of neat. Anyway, it also receives voxel lighting. This is another one of the motivations behind using voxel-based lighting, is that it can be received by the fog. So it really helps to like ground it to the environment and stuff. Let me just like turn it off to the wrong lighting. That's what that looks like. It's subtle, but trust me, it really matters. Anyway, let's open this door real quick and look at some shadows. There are built-in water breaks for me in this talk. So sampling the shadows without any temporal or spatial filtering yields this sort of like shimmery, voxel, goopity stuff that I don't really like looking at. So the way that we filter our fog is not temporally. There's no feedback effect going on whatsoever. It's just pure spatial filtering, which lets us do really like quick effects on the fog for gameplay reasons when we want to. The spatial filtering is mipmaps. So it's mipmaps on shadows, which means, you probably guessed this, it's nearest filtering because it's not moment shadows or anything like that. And these mipmaps are simply generated the same way that the classic sort of Killzone 2 style stable cascades is done, but at each resolution it's also stable across the board. And they're sampled with DDX, DDY, and DDZ. The DDZ isn't a hardware thing, you just gotta like find that analytically. Anyway, across the bridge you find these some crystals here. Let's not worry about those yet. But as I'm a big fan of this voxel, light on voxel fog, let me just one more time like turn the wrong lighting onto that one for a hot second. There we go. All right. So now it's got some random ambient color on it. I don't like it. Here it is with the right one. Anyway, flying into the clouds up here with this cool crane, we'll see the fog increase below. All right, so one more time, I'm going to reiterate that if you look at the part of the fog that's sort of under the cliff over there, it's currently like shadowed correctly by the voxel lighting. And if I return to just a uniform lighting situation, you get this sort of like bright, typical distance fog effect that I'm not too fond of. So I'm just really big old advocate of getting 3D spatial lighting on your fog. I think it's pretty good for predictable lighting, especially in this world where fog makes up such a big part of the photons hitting your eyes. Anyway, volumes are defined by a regular box transform. Let me zoom out and take a look at what I mean. So this is this particular voxel fog volume here, just a bounding box that you set up. And of course, as we sort of zoomed up into it, the density increased. But you can also do other things. You can animate the color, and you can add this like more turbulent noise to it, make it all grimy and stuff. And like the shadows, this is sampled with DDX, DDY, DDZ for manual MIP selection. This just means that there's no texture aliasing being produced by this particular effect, which is good. Now, like I said, it's a localized fog solution, so we have to voxelize these fog bounding volumes somehow. And as you know by now, I'm a big fan of abusing the rasterizer for naughty things. Did you know that on top of being a great ray tracer, the rasterizer is also a really good box voxelizer? So when we are drawing the fog, what we do is we render to a layer buffer. And we render out the boxes as quads instead, and we want to do them as sort of cross-sections of a box, essentially, using these quads. So like our lighting ray tracer, we assign the slice ID to be the instance ID in the vertex here. That makes sense, but now they sort of just draw us like full screen quads, which is not what we want. We want them to draw within the bounds of the box, of course. So to only draw within the lines, so to speak, what we do is we trace a line. We do a line trace from the back of the box to the front of the box, and we find where that particular line intersects the slice plane. And then we set our position to that. And that then yields being able to draw only inside the left, right, top, bottom sides of the box. And now that still leaves the back and front of box to be spilled out of. So the way that we handle that is just to set the fragment set position to be the T value of that line trace. And that then abuses the fact that the rasterizer has built in plane clipping for, well, the near plane and the far plane of a camera. And that's what we're using to make sure that we only color in the four sides of the box. This is a pretty neat method of only generating fragment threads where we need them. I think it's neat that the GPU is capable of just generating threads where we need them. It also lets us use the built-in hardware blending, which I think is quite neat. And yeah, that's how we blend multiple fog volumes together. And this sort of concludes the base of our rendering. So let's shift to some more visual effects type stuff. After each world orb, you gain a new ability, and the orb takes on a second role. Well, at least if we had beaten the boss. I'm skipping all gameplay spoilers for, reasons. Anyway, from the orb, an asteroid belt appears, and within it, you see, within its orbit, this crystalline bridge is revealed. And this isn't the first time we've seen this bridge. Through the gate and over the bridge, we saw these large deposits of crystals that I told you not to worry about. Anyway, out here, the orb reveals it, and within it, you see these structures made up of cellular crystals. It's a volumetric Voronoi diagram, which is made with a regular point grid. That regular point grid is then just orbited around with a pseudo-random value. What we can do is, of course, we can find our nearest cell that we're inside, and we can intersect the next cell that we would see along our view ray. And then the interior position is just shaded using our regular lighting function, and so is the exterior. And then there's just a refraction and some blending going on between them to get this interior look. And finally, this is sort of like monotonous looking in terms of color, so to add a little bit of a splash, we use some irradiance that's just a scrolling texture along the Lambert and Fresnel products of the dot products. Anyway, that's just multiply on top of the specular and the diffuse color. Since we use the regular lighting function, it fits nicely into the various worlds, and even does a little bit of a cute reflection there and some cute shadow drawing on the ground there. Good use of transparent cutouts. Now, the actual ability to reveal these bridges is an alpha dissolve circle that's driven by the asteroid belt, and it's quantized to just be per crystal. So the way that this is handled is just you sample the alpha value just by intersecting the orbital plane, and then you get the orbital distance to this orbital plane, and then you smooth step it at a range. But of course, you make sure to sample this value with the center of a cell, and that's really how that's done. So that's our first orb. And I think this trick of having interior rendering as an effect on geometry is something that we enjoy using quite a bit. It's liberally used on various emissive effects, such as like just throughout the game, but this is a particular like procedural example of it. Anyway, here's our second orb. All right, now we splashed in here. So in this world is this boggish water that I just turned off, and now it's back. It adds this refraction and this reflection effect on just the whole world. And also within this water, you find this fog, which I've just removed. It's this murk that you see below and above. And the way it's made is just like with a regular fog volume, like the regular fog effect, there's a bright one on top of the water and a dark one below. And of course, the water surface itself starts with blurry refraction, which is just using a standard like grab or opaque pass texture thing, which works naively with the fog because the fog is applied during like regular opaque or transparent passes. So when you grab a snapshot of that, that has the fog built into it. So this is the pure refraction without any fog on it, and here it is with. I think it's just neat that the water doesn't have its own like bespoke fog system, because it means that we get like the nice shadows and the nice indirect shadows of the built-in fog system. Anyway, so the actual normals of that refraction are using a little bit of a cute trick. I wanted to do something to indicate the shore and help ground the water to the environment, but I didn't want to use like edge film or something. So it's got these edge ripples, which are made with something called a shore map, which is basically like an SDF to the nearest shore as a vector. Anyway, so you take the distance of that, you can animate the distance with a sine and fade it with the distance of that same SDF, and then multiply the nearest direction onto it. And yeah, the texture is just an RGB texture with red and green for direction, and in the blue channel you find the fall off or distance. It looks like this. It's made with a offline tool that just generates it and compresses it. It's rendered with just a giant camera above the entire world, which then uses a replacement shader, geometry shader, that at each intersection of a triangle, it generates a line that intersects and expands a quad and renders out the distance and direction of that particular point. Now, the actual just wobbly normals on top of all this is just two scrolling normals. It's kind of boring. But with one little trick, what it does is it stretches out the normals using the shore vector to create this sort of anisotropic stretching effect along the shoreline, which just slows down the scrolling along the beach line of it and sort of helps it integrate into the actual ripples that then get layered on top, so it doesn't just look like a linear blend between the two effects. Anyway, I think this contribution of procedural ripples on top of textured normals makes for a nice mix, especially with the anisotropic stretching along the side there. Anyway, now, naturally, we have planar reflections, and they're pretty normal, just a low-res planar reflection thing with another camera. And it's using a lot of MSA to hide the coarseness of this planar reflection. And like the warps, it's also using static shadows to make sure that we don't do any shadow rendering in the reflections. Speaking of warps, we gotta avoid this guy. There he is. So this diorama out here is also a planar reflection. It's handmade for each warp point with a little bit of diorama geometry that's just made bespokely for this particular warp point, and this is what that looks like. To flatten the look, it's rendered with a green skybox behind it, a green light, and some fog. Here they are without. The light and the fog just adds a bit of milkiness, so you can see the light, there we go, adds some colored milkiness, and then the fog just sort of flattens it all out to sort of not distract the image too much. Much like the warps, the reflections use the same sort of tricks like pruning in the culling matrix a little bit so we don't draw anything that's outside that boundary, as well as a scissor rectangle, kind of makes sense, and of course a depth mask just to avoid any unnecessary graphics work. And yeah, this effect idea is practically invented for this particular puzzle, so that was a good use. Anyway, let's see. I think that was the only puzzle spoiler during this whole talk. Sorry about that. Let's walk through this door. about that later. All right, I'm going to quickly touch on just like the specular light, because we don't use a skybox sun. Instead, we use an analytic specular light, which I just removed. If you look in the lower left corner, you see a little bit of a shimmery, shiny stuff that's now coming back. There it is. So the only kind of funny trick with this is that I didn't really want to sample the shadow texture. I just wanted to sample something else for cheapsies. And the trick here was just to sample the depth buffer of the reflection and use the sampler comparison state on the far plane. And yeah, that gets you, frankly, correct shadows in that. Now, ominously out here, it's kind of started to rain, which is rippling out on the surface. And I think it is so subtle that a mix of projector and MPEG compression has probably killed it off. No biggie. Let's isolate it. So very similarly to the shore ripples, it's like this Voronoi diagram texture that I dubbed the rain map, where you can animate a distance with sine and then multiply a direction on top of it. And then we've got, just to randomize it all, we've got an index that we can just scatter around that animation a bunch. Much like the shore, it's also just got like red and green for direction. In the blue channel, you have the distance that the sign is animating using, and that randomization index is in the alpha channel. Luckily, we have 4 of those channels. Anyway, so I kind of just thought it was fun that the crystalline bridges Voronoi diagram and the SDF of the shore ripples kind of come together for this one effect. Now, that box over there looks really interesting, but if you haven't noticed, we're kind of skipping all of that. So we now have a second orb ability, and this one is kind of a reversal of the last, because instead of revealing crystalline bridges, this one is a vanishing trick on these columns, which we can now use to ascend. So when cloaked, as it's called, the solid volumes turn into this transparent fog effect that you can just go in and out of at will. And like the crystalline bridges, we've seen these things before. We saw them just past the door in the wet world. And out here, the shading is done in a similar way to the orbs. Like them, it's a ray marched effect, but instead of ray marching inside of a sphere, this is ray marching inside of a bounding box, but with some little bit of distortion on it, which then also needs to have the bounding box, expanded a little bit to fit that distortion. The shading is sporting much like the fog, a very simplified shading model, with non-directional indirect lighting, so we don't have to sample the directional stuff, as well as just sunlight, and of course the orb light. That's the most important, arguably speaking. And as usual, I'm a big fan of visual effects that use the proper lighting model because it helps things fit into the environment. Here you see that the indirect lighting being sampled correctly kind of like lets it fit into this, sort of socket there. And out here, the sunlight helps it really, ground into this cliff face here. Anyway, back on track. So one final point about the transition between these things. Going from opaque to transparent comes in a few layers. So I'm just going to peel back one by one. So let's go down again. All right. So now there's none of it. And then we, of course, fade in that foggy column. There we go. The fade in is simply just you have the height of this effect and do a smooth step, kind of expected. And then the column itself comes in with a clipping plane. So this is SV clip distance. It's a pretty good way to do that. But then to hide that seam, that weird cut there, we then fade in on top of that sort of like a glow that's using the same clip plane. It's just rendering the same mesh again, but now with a very simplified glowy shader. And then to get the other side of that thing, we then render that again, but with the opposite clip plane and fade that on top of it. Now we have sort of like this transitional state that we can use to go between the solid and the transparent versions. And yeah, that's another orb. I think this idea of using like the clip plane is a nice way to like do transitions between transparent and opaque things. I haven't really found any hardware that like cares that you put a clip plane in there as long as you're not using it. Unlike something like SV coverage or discard or whatever, which the hardware does care if you use those things. Anyway, that is now time for our third orb. I wonder what's in there. So, in this alien world covered in translucent skin membranes, it's all about refraction. Beneath its fleshy surface, you see this organic interior. And the exterior is quite simple. sporting a normal map, and some oscillating emissive textures for bioluminescence. But the important part really is the interior. It's partially using the same opaque graph paths as the water when we need to see the player inside of it, but when we want to see the player on top of it and avoid occlusion and disocclusion artifacts, it's using an off-screen texture. And that off-screen texture looks like this. It just has like interior parts rendered into just this one part. And then the actual refraction is kind of standard. You know, you sample the off-screen texture with some refractive normals on top of it to sort of break it up a little bit, and some directional blur. And this is to hide the fact that this is a heavily under or downsampled effect. What I mean by that is that the off-screen texture is rendered at a lower resolution because, well, it's off-screen. We don't really want to spend too many resources on that. And the graph path is then, of course, downsampled just to give it like some initial blur. But this will create some inevitable bilinear artifacts if you don't like try to like just hide that with a little bit of a directional blur. Anyway, I quite like this trip down to our fogging. So let's take a look at that. Down here is one of the few places where there's no sunlight in the game. It's just this big glow at the center where we find the transporter. And you see these organic interior membranes down below, and the interiors are even lit up. I'm going to make them dark. So to do this, the membranes on the exterior just cast shadows with their back faces. It's nothing fancy. It's just important that the interior is not shadowed by the exterior. And of course, like above, these things are things that the player can walk on top of, so it's important that they use the off-screen texture to avoid any occlusion artifacts. Anyway, I know we've just taken a lift, but this one's real cool, so we're going to take this one too. So we're out of the cave and back on the surface, and oh, what's this? So foreshadowing the orb's ability, just beyond the gate we have a bunch of, well, orbs. I'm going to show you one more refraction thing just to knock the point home. So inside this refraction effect, you also have this sort of like fog that's filling out this effect. You probably guessed that this is, you know, a depth range with some color on top. And when you're sampling a depth range, especially an under or downsampled depth range, downsampled with like min-max filter, to get the depth range, you know, you'll normally do something with bilinear filtering here. If you just want something like a depth mask, you know, obviously you'll use something like sample comparison state to like get a nicely anti-aliased and filtered mask for shadows and stuff. But if you're doing something with a range, you know, typically you'll, you know, do like a linear sample of it and then do your smooth step or inverse step or whatever you want to do. But this creates this edge artifact around discontinuancies of objects, which I'm not a fan of. So the trick is instead to use gather red, for those of you who are into that. You probably guessed it already. And then do your range or smooth step or whatever operation and then interpolate it. This is sort of like, I guess you could call it smooth PCF or something. And it's a tool that's come in handy numerous times. Now, we use these depth masks quite a lot throughout the game. In this case, we're using it to ground reflections. And here you see an example where we're doing the naive implementation, and you'll see some sort of stair-stepping artifacts around various places. And now I'm going to do that to fix it. So here we just do the smooth step before we do any interpolation. The same thing counts for refraction. You might see, yeah, sort of, some like fringes around objects that, you know, have a few pixel shimmers in them. And by doing the operation before we interpolate, they go away. I think in a game where MSAA is our only anti-aliasing, it's important not to introduce any aliasing artifacts for depth sampling effects. So for this Orbs ability, now the world is full of eggs, which contain our orb. All of them do. So this was what the foreshadowing from before was. Back outside, you see around here are these weird stacks of creatures. And affectionately, our speedrunners call these guys Blorbo, but the canonical name is Orb Grabber. That's not a problem, though. There's lots of eggs around, so we can get it back. So if I hadn't skipped this bit, this is where you would see these guys foreshadowed from just before the door. This organic thief, like its mechanical cousin, are members of this funny kleptomatic family who just really love our property. So before I hadn't really shown them how they steal our orb. Oh, sorry. There we go. It has now encased our key in amber, but we can still see inside of it. It's using the same off-screen texture as the other refraction effects I showed earlier, but instead of a fog inside, what you see is inside there's this volume light that's filling out the interior, and you can see it sort of spill into the surroundings a little bit. This effect is ray-marched inside a sphere and has two parts to it. One, of course, the cookie texture, naturally, and the other part is the inverse squared fall-off. And marching is done in, you probably guessed this, equiangular fashion invented by Simon Brown, meaning that rather than stepping linearly, what we do is, which would look like this. It's pretty noisy, pretty terrible. What we do is step in angles along the line, of course. Doing so steps linearly in the cookie's angular domain and importance samples the inverse squared fall off. But I had a couple of texture and arithmetic optimizations to add to this. So firstly, the heterogeneous part is affected by, which is affected by fall off, remains constant throughout the march. So we can just move that out of the loop and just integrate the cookie alone in the loop, which is kind of nice. The second part is that we want to avoid cookie noise, even with our low step count. By trilinear, we could use trilinear, but it's twice as expensive as bilinear, so we just use bilinear with the worst case MIP. And finally, since it's a linear rotation, we can actually avoid having any trigonometry in our loop. So we just move that out and do a linear rotation for each step, which is kind of nice. And yeah, we use volume lights for orbs, warp portals, keys, tons of other things where we want more like pixel-sharp volume lighting than our Froxel fog would otherwise give us. Anyway, out here they've been fracking and processing this amber and storing it in these pools. It's basically just water, but without planar reflections, just pure refractions, but with a lot more fog and acting as an emissive during light bake. I might argue that light emissive has a lot to do with it. So this is not the first time we saw this either. It's kind of endemic to this world. And out here, you see that they've turned it into these amber pods out here, which use the same shader as our amber crystals that I just showed you with the volume light inside of them, which we've also seen light the way across our adventure. I'm especially fond of how it lights up the fog in this particular shot here, in this cauldron of fog here. Anyway, so far we've traveled to 3 inner worlds in our other what if that wasn't the outer world. Each world, including the one we just came out of, has this ancestral detector, which just jumped into the orb to fulfill their role. And if I hadn't skipped them, this wouldn't be the first time we were seeing these folks. During your adventure, you encounter these illuminated moons. And within each one, you discover your world orb and meet their boss. Let me break that. Let me break down effect down one by bit. Anyway, so back to neutral. And before awakening, these ancestors get this statue appearance on them, which is done with the same kind of shader trick as the, what's it called? Yeah, cloak effect. But instead of a glowy green emissive color, it's just using a dark blue albedo. And as they prepare to jump in, once they're frozen in this material, they dissolve into this cloud of particles. Originally, this was done with 2 deadly shader sins. The turbulent dissolve was done using a geometry shader, and it was fed by a tessellation shader. The tessellation simply ensured equal particle size. I only confess to this because it didn't ship. I wrote a CPU preprocessor that tessellates the mesh to avoid our Holland domain sins. But what about the geometry? Well, you can see that in the top of it, it's got this midpoint where it's like just averaging the 3 vertices of the primitive and using that to drive the rest of the effect. So basically what I ended up doing was just in the preprocessor, I write this vector to the mid into the tangent of the mesh, which then, even in the case of something like a skinned mesh, will be transformed correctly into world space so that we can just, do this whole thing in the vertex shader without any geometry shader needs, because really we just needed the midpoint. Anyway, first this effect scales down each, what's it called, triangle into a little smaller point, then gives them a little bit of a fuzzy random spin around, and then orbits them in some like turbulent cloud kind of thing going on there, and then just translates them down toward a point to like suck them into the orb there. And yeah, that's really how that works. So now, where are we? Well, we are out of the gray world and into the sun world, which has this faint warm glow in its thick cold atmosphere. It's a world that plays heavily with light and fog in a bigger role. It's kind of like we're floating somewhere. Anyway, throughout the world you see these orbs that emanate this energy of like either light or, in this case, these ripples from them that we're now going to look into a little bit. And each of these orbs also had a little bit of a secret inside of them. Their material uses the same shader as the amber we saw before with the, what's it called, volume light. But instead of it being the center, the transform of that volume light is now an orb, which I just thought was a kind of a neat recycling of an effect there. Anyway, so the ripples on the ground here, they're done similarly to the water shore. It's an SDF, but to the spheres instead of to the shore. So unlike the water surface, this isn't a texture. Instead, much like forward lights, for example, this is done using a uniform array in the shader. So this isn't the first time we've done it this way, and it also won't be the last. The waves emanating from the orb on this portal here are also done with such a uniform array, and so are the footsteps on the ground. In my opinion, this is a neat or nice alternative to something like an off-screen ripple or normal's texture. Anyway, back out here, the world is starting to heat up a little bit, so let me just break down this lighting here that we got going on. Here it is without any fog or any bespoke lighting. It's very dark and barren. You add the fog here, it's doing some of the heavy lifting, separating the playground and the foreground quite a bit. And you add the lighting, and it's kind of doing the same task. It's a baked emissive specifically for this world to get its hot underglow going. And without the fog, it gets a little bit jarring. So they're definitely set up in tandem, these two things. But you see the cold from above and the hot from below that sort of helps separate playground and foreground a little bit better. And we use this baked emissive quite a lot for lighting scenes in various places. In this case, where we didn't have any sunlight, it's used to light up this place quite a bit. Here it is without any of these baked emissive things. It's quite jarring, a little bit dark. And here it is back again. This is just 2 large soft boxes found on either like extreme side of this big cave here. Anyway, back out here, again, once again warmer, once again brighter, temperatures increasing. Now, we're close to the end, so deep breaths, especially for me. There's still one more big component of the worlds within worlds puzzle. And to show it to you, we're going to have to go on a small journey. But it's my favorite part, so we're just going to take this lift over there. So, here's this weird structure which our animator Carl did. Much like Orbs is made with 2 cameras. The inner camera looks like this. You can see the duplicated environment to the other side. You have a little bit of sand stuff kind of leaking over there. Of course, we've also called our objects correctly, fit them with a scissor rectangle, and also masked them out with the world's edge. And the same thing on the other side. We make sure to do a nice depth repass out here so that we don't render any fragments we don't want to render. This game did ship on Switch, so anyway, before composing them together just naively like the warps as well. Anyway, bringing the worlds together, we have this shadowed fog that's coming through, which is then, of course, lit by this light that's also coming through. The light is because you see how now without the light, the sun is being shadowed by the door, and on the other side it's also shadowed. This is so that the one spotlight is the only thing that's coming in the sort of intersection to sort of hide the seams of the sun, or the seams of lighting, I guess you could say. Anyway, the light is simply duplicated on either side. We also have the door shadowed. Here I removed the door shadows. The door shadows are simply done by having, there you go, there's these two planes that sort of like stick to the door frame. And yeah, just make sure that the duplicated light doesn't shadow around the sides. Anyway, let's walk through. Naturally, as we pass through the portal plane, at some point we actually teleport, but you can't see which frame. Out here in the gray world is another boss that I skipped up ahead. It's a can of worms. I don't want to talk about it. Right. So let's get out of here. We have one more portal to look at. Sorry if this transition's jarring. All right. Out here once again, a lot brighter, a lot warmer. None of our concern. We're just here on a stop to the other one. In the purple world, and here's another door. And oh, there's water on the other side too. I hate this door. Anyway, on the other side, the other water introduces yet another recursive camera. Luckily, the coloring, cropping, all that masking really helps us a lot. On the outside here, we see these refractive orbs and stuff, just and ripples on the ground. Oh, and yeah, we got a crystalline bridge that we're walking through across as well. This scene was really the profiling benchmark of this game, and oh, sure, why not? I mean, we got the misty columns there as well, just everything expensive in one scene. Very nicely designed. As usual, I won't spoil anything, but over here is the final puzzle of the game, and I promise you it rules. It gets really, really weird. But let's wrap this up. Cosmic journey is nearly complete. Another portal. Getting good mileage out of this thing. Up here. What I did was I really concentrated fog density around the penumbra of the shadows to heavily exaggerate that shadow. Orbs are giving us a little final goodbye. Take this diving board. I like my narration. I'm just trying to fill out the silence. Reveal trailer. This shot here, a world within a world within a world, and so on. This shot was actually born in our reveal trailer before it became our ending. Back then we didn't have that world there. Abrupt. Anyway, so as things unfold, the sun's atmosphere is shadowed by the sun's architecture. Here I've disabled that particular shadow. Like the orbs, it's just shadowed with a regular cookie texture of sorts. But instead of shadowing some bespoke ray margin effect, this is just the regular fog that you find throughout the game. Sorry, Jacob, this is rude. Cover is taken off of these planet representations made by Nikki to reveal the spotlight effect that's going on here. That spotlight in particular. So it's not a point light, it's a spotlight because we really wanted these self-shadows. I'm going to remove them. Now they're back. And of course, if it was a point light, even if they had shadows at this distance, it'd be like 1 degree. So I think the resolution would have to be 2 million pixels to get anything done there. Anyway. So anyway, the planet's atmosphere is this round fog volume that you find around the planet. Here it is without, now it's back. It's shadowed using a custom sort of blob shadow function, which now it's gone, now it's back. And because our fog doesn't have any, temporal sampling thing going on, we can just animate the fog like this, and it's not going to fall behind or anything like that. It's not going to ghost. Won't he let that play now? Anyway, to exaggerate this space fog a bit, I added a shallow wall of higher density fog right at the intersection of the planet. Here it is without, now it's back. The reason for this intersection is because then I know that it's going to be 100% shadowed on the left side and 100% not shadowed on the right side, giving much higher contrast. Here's that fake blob shadow gone again, and now it's back again. Jeppe for egging me on to do it, and I would like to thank @JG for egging Jeppe on to egg me on to do this thing. Thanks to Kissa and the advisory board for trusting me with content, and thank you to Tuki for letting me liberally borrow her MacBook, and also thank you for saying yes on Wednesday. Credits music really gets people clapping. I thought that would work. All right, I can see on the time that I have 2 minutes and 30 seconds. So if anyone wants to be the brave soul to get the one question in. Otherwise, I will be outside talking to y'all, and so will the rest of the team over there. Thank you for coming. One last housekeeping thing. Please rate my talk. Give it 5 stars, Thank you for coming. Have a great rest of your Friday.